Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. Really looking forward to discussing with you all. It seems like a really nice, diverse group, apart from the fact that you're all called JLAN. What I thought I'd do just in my 10 minutes is to try to sort of give a little bit of a framework for how we should think about democracy, because it sort of turns out that, although everyone thinks they know what democracy is, it's actually quite a complex subject, and people talk about it in different ways and understand different things by democracy. I should also say that I'm, insofar as I'm an expert on democracy, it's basically democracy in Europe and the United States. I've been working on a project in the Europe program at Chatham House on democracy in Europe, and I wrote a report which came out last March, which I'm sharing in the chat right now. I've been thinking quite a lot about the crisis of liberal democracy in Europe compared to the United States, and I'll come back to that. But most of the questions that you asked me, or a lot of the questions you asked me, are about other parts of the world that you're from. And I don't know much about those countries, not enough, at least, about democracy and the state of democracy in those countries. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer most of your questions, but as I say, what I'll try and do is give a bit of a framework for how we should think about democracy, and then hopefully that will help you to be able to answer those questions for yourself in a slightly different way, perhaps. And really, what I want to say in my sort of 10 minutes is really that, the biggest mistake I think that you can make when thinking about democracy, this is my personal view, is to think that, there's one problem and it's the same all around the world as far as democracy goes. There is a bit of a tendency right now to think in those terms. So, the way that, for example, this concept of populism, has been used in such an inflationary way. And I think a lot of people do just basically think there is a worldwide threat to democracy from populism, and that's basically the story. I basically want to say, no, that's not true. There are multiple threats to democracy. The threat from populism is not the only threat to democracy. And it's different in each region and in each country. And so I think you really have to look at the individual national context with a kind of theoretical kind of framework for understanding democracy. And then I think you can begin to think about the threats to democracy and how to sort of respond to those. So I guess a good place to start is the concept of liberal democracy, because we often just use the shorthand democracy, but often what we mean by that is liberal democracy. That's basically the model that I think most of us agree is the sort of right model for political organization. And liberal democracy is something slightly different from democracy. So in particular, I think you have to distinguish between the liberal part and the democracy part. A lot of people use liberalism and democracy almost as synonyms, right? As if it's just the same thing. But liberalism and democracy aren't the same thing at all. And in a liberal democracy, there's a kind of a tension between liberalism and democracy. So what I mean by liberalism, well, actually, let me start with democracy. Democracy, essentially, I mean, it's in a sense quite simple. It's popular sovereignty, right? In particular, embodied through elections. That's the basic idea of democracy. Liberalism, on the other hand, is something slightly different. It's a system of individual rights, usually guaranteed by a constitution. And so you have this kind of popular element and a sort of constitutional element of liberal democracy. And as I say, they're in tension. So liberalism, far from being a synonym for democracy, liberalism actually constrains democracy, and democracy constrains liberalism. There's a tension between them. So, in particular, the system of rights that are guaranteed by a constitution, they're basically meant to be outside of the space of democratic contestation, right? Insofar as you can change a constitution and change a system of rights, That's quite hard to do. You can't just elect a government and then abandon the system of rights. In fact, if you do that, it leads to what is sometimes called illiberal democracy, right? So you have the democracy part, but you don't have the liberal part, you have illiberal democracy. So I think if you think about democracy in that way, in terms of liberal democracy with these two elements to it that are in tension with each other, then it becomes easier to see how there are multiple threats to democracy. In particular, you can go too far in one direction or too far in the other direction. And there are lots of different ways of thinking about those dangers. One would be to think about, for example, technocracy versus populism. And this illustrates my point that, you know, populism isn't the only threat. There's also a kind of a complementary threat from something like technocracy. And again, I'll come back to that a bit later. You can also think about it in terms of, as I say, illiberal democracy versus undemocratic liberalism, right? Because you can have a system where there's you have guaranteed rights, but you don't have democracy. Another way to think about it, that one political scientist uses these terms, is responsible government and responsive government, right? So responsible government corresponding to the kind of constitutional pillar of democracy, and responsive government corresponding to the popular element of democracy. And then a final way of thinking about it is, you know, these two dangers, you can go too far in one direction or another. So some people talk about aristocratic excess or democratic excess, right? So aristocratic excess is where you have, you know, the system of rights embodied by a constitution going so far that that you know that you create a kind of elite essentially that runs, you know, that governs. And democratic excess is the opposite danger, sometimes kind of referred to as a sort of tyranny of the majority, right? So you have a very democratic system in some ways, but that ends up infringing on minority rights. So, you know, I whizzed through that. I know I threw a lot at you, but it was really just to illustrate the simple point that there are multiple threats to democracy, and that liberal democracy is something slightly distinct from democracy itself. And part of the reason I mention all that is because quite a few of the questions refer to human rights and rights in general. And there, I think it's important to distinguish between the liberal part, which is really what rights relate to, and the democratic part. So that's roughly the way that I think about democracy and the crisis of liberal democracy. And I'll just finish this part of it by saying that, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that you know, I work on Europe and the United States. And there in particular, a lot of people tend to think that you have the same problem in Europe and the United States. Again, people think about populism, and they also think about polarization, right? In the United States, it's clearly the case that one of the big threats to democracy there is polarization. You have these kind of two almost tribes in America now, and the country's very polarized. Now, I think Europe's almost the opposite from that, right? That the main threat is not so much populism as technocracy, and a lot of that has to do with the European Union, which is the sort of ultimate model of technocratic governance. And populism is largely a response to technocracy. So, you know, technocracy is more a problem, I think, or as much of a problem, at least in Europe, as populism is. And the problem in Europe is not polarization. It's the opposite. What you've had is convergence, actually, between, you know, basically the right and the left over the last 30, 40 years in Europe. So again, it's sort of almost the opposite problem as in the United States. So even if you take the West, as it were, you can already see that there's a lot of complexity and a lot of differences between Europe and the United States. And I could then get into, you know, different European countries. There's also some complexity there, right? And that, as I say, all brings me to your questions, which, you know, relate to lots of other parts of the world. And as I say, I don't really have answers to to a lot of the questions that you've asked me, because I just don't know enough about the particular conditions in these countries, for example, in African countries. But I hope that sort of helping you to think about about democracy in theoretical terms and what the threats to it are might help you to answer some of those questions for yourselves. So Max, I don't know if, I can now sort of start going through the questions and offer a few observations, or if people want to jump in at this point, I'm happy to sort of answer any questions or respond to any comments about what I've said so far.
Yeah, so if you can maybe start by going through the questions, that if you've got responses to some of them, as I said, some of them might require additional inputs from our community members. So if you maybe start with what you've got ready, so to speak. Thank you very much for the presentation, by the way, I should say. Thanks for this. And then we are going to ask our community members to write their names down or to raise their hands. So if you can use the chat, it'll be easier on us because we can just put your names on the list. So Hans, over to you now, and then we're going to give them a chance to ask additional questions.
So yes, I guess I'll just sort of go through them one by one and very briefly just offer some observations. So the first question is about youth, and in fact one or two of the other questions I think mentioned youth, and obviously that's the focus for your project. The sort of question of young people in democracy is a really interesting one and a really important one. And again, it's quite complex, and really all I'll say is that there's no consensus about whether young people are becoming disillusioned with democracy or not. Some academics claim that there is this trend in some parts of the world that young people are being turned off from democracy. And some people relate that to technology, the digital technology, that, the idea that, young people are so accustomed to sort of clicking on things and having immediate responses that democracy now seems kind of analog. And that's leading to a certain kind of disillusionment with democracy. But a lot of people question that argument. And, one of the things, even digital technology, you can easily argue it the other way around, which is that, that social media in particular has led to an incredible explosion of political activity by young people. And so in that sense, it's been, really good, and that actually young people are more engaged in democracy than older people are. Now, again, this comes back to, how exactly you understand democracy. Are we just talking about, elections and people voting? Or do we also think that, organizing and debating and all of these kinds of things are also important to the quality of democracy, even if they destabilize governments, which they sometimes do. So that's my thought on youth. Transitional justice, I'm afraid I know nothing about. I have lots of colleagues at Chatham House who do know about that, but I just don't know enough about transitional justice to know how it really relates to democratization. I'll note that there is a debate now in the United States. It's quite interesting. In fact, my colleague Leslie Vinjamuri just wrote a piece the other day that's on the Chatham House website. I'll see if I can find it in a minute, which is about exactly this. There's now talk of whether you might need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, along the South African model in the United States after Trump. And it's not enough to impeach and convict Trump, but to actually really bring the country together, you might need something along the South African model, which is quite interesting. Myanmar and the military. Again, very interesting question. Most of the countries that I've worked on in, as I say, Europe and the United States, the military doesn't play quite the same role as it does in some of some non-Western countries like Myanmar. But again, it's interesting how what's going on in the United States now is bringing some of these questions back. Questions that we thought were sort of irrelevant or dealt with in the United States. And here again, I would say it's quite complex, the role of the military, because on the one hand, as the question from Ugo points out, you don't want the military to have a coup. But at the same time, the military can play quite an important role in democratization. And here, I think one very interesting example is if you think back to civil rights in the United States in the 60s, President Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne Division, American paratroopers, to the South, the American South, in order to allow Black Americans in the South to vote, right? So, you actually need the military to help make democracy possible. So again, it's quite complicated. Then the next two questions are kind of about human rights. So again, I would sort of say, look, these are very important issues, but I think it's important to distinguish questions around human rights from questions of democracy. They are distinct. The question from Clinton about democratic backsliding through impairing free and fair elections. That's a very, very important question. I think we can all agree, though, that you have to guarantee free and fair elections. It's sort of minimum condition for democracy, and so I think that's fairly uncontroversial. I don't have any particular advice on how you protect elections from being impaired in that way, though. The next question from Giorno about the economy. This is really interesting, and it's also I'll answer it together with the question later on from Ceylan, from the real Ceylan, I guess, about the economy. The relationship between the economy and democracy is fascinating. Again, very, very complex. And actually, we're doing a big strand of work on this in the Europe program as the next phase of our democracy project. I basically, there's lots of different views on this. So this isn't, a definitive view, but my personal view, based on the research that I've done and my own views, is that, I agree very much with the question that both questioners actually, that the economic policy of the last 30 or 40 years, I would call it neoliberalism, has had negative consequences for democracy. It's very much also connected to debates around globalization, or what Danny Roderick calls hyperglobalization. Danny Roderick basically argues that hyperglobalization has undermined democracy, and I think that's basically right. I can say more about that if you're interested. Fun question about the monarchy, which is interesting for a Brit, because obviously we're a monarchy too. I guess what I would say in response to that question is that I don't see monarchy and democracy as being sort of opposites or incompatible, as I think Britain illustrates, and not just Britain, other countries, Japan, lots of other European countries like Sweden, but other countries around the world as well. I think you can have a democracy that is a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. So you can have a liberal democracy that is also a monarchy. To me, that feels almost like a secondary choice, is do you have as your head of government, head of state, as opposed to head of government, do you have an unelected monarch or do you have an elected president, for example? Right now, as I say, if I look at the countries around the world that are, and the quality of democracy in different countries, I don't see any obvious relationship between the two. It's not obvious to me that republics, i.e. ones that have an elected president as head of state, are better democracies than constitutional monarchies. Nor do I think that constitutional monarchies are better. I just think it's, they can both work, right? But my point is that the real contrast is not democracy and monarchy. The real contrast is a republic versus a monarchy. And a republic is certainly compatible with democracy, and so is a monarchy. And then the other question from Ceylan, but also the question from Agnes, is about civic engagement. I'm not sure I fully understood the question from Ceylan about this, so maybe you can explain it to me. But civic engagement is clearly important. again, it comes back to different understandings of democracy. There's a minimal definition of democracy, which really just revolves around free and fair elections. But lots of people would argue that, at least in terms of a sort of high quality of democracy, you need more than just that minimum. You do need basically a kind of a public sphere with a high quality of debate, and obviously that depends on some rights like free media and so on. That's important to something beyond a kind of minimal understanding of democracy. And what I didn't quite understand, though, in the questions is what the sort of dilemma you saw there. You both seem to see a dilemma, Ceylan and Agnes, but I couldn't quite see what it was. I mean, for example, Agnes, you seem to be suggesting that that there was a sort of tension somehow between grassroots and leadership development, perhaps. I wasn't quite sure, so maybe you could explain that. And then one final point, which comes out of Agnes's question, which I think is really important, is certainly in Europe and the United States, one of the biggest fault lines now, and I think this is a threat to democracy, is precisely between, it's a sort of education gap, right? We now starting to have this situation where particular political parties are very closely aligned with either college graduates or with non-college graduates. This came out very strongly in the Brexit referendum, where it was overwhelmingly non-college graduates who voted to leave the European Union and college graduates who voted to remain. So I think certainly from a sort of British perspective, but also I think a wider sort of perspective in Europe and the United States, that kind of educational divide is a real problem.